Hello everyone, welcome to Beyond the Veil. Today, Dr. Eben Alexander, a former Harvard neurosurgeon, reveals his extraordinary journey beyond the veil. In 2008, a near-death experience transformed his understanding of consciousness and the universe. Join us as he shares insights from his profound journey, offering a glimpse into the realms beyond our physical reality.
Hello, I'm Dr. Eben Alexander, former Harvard neurosurgeon, and what I'd like to do is share with you some of the aspects of my near-death experience that happened back in 2008 in hopes that that might help you come to a deeper understanding of your own spiritual nature and the nature of the universe at large. It all started with me being an academic neurosurgeon growing up in a family, a very scientific family. My adoptive father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. And that's really what shaped the first few decades of my life and really set the stage for building up towards this near-death experience that happened in November of 2008. Now, when all that happened, by that time, I honed a pretty kind of scientific worldview. What I thought was a scientific worldview. It has to do with the training, scientific training of a neurosurgeon, for example, in the 20th and early 21st century. But what you find is that science was woefully inadequate when it's only the Newtonian deterministic form of science that pretends that only the physical world exists, and therefore consciousness must be explained by the workings of the physical matter of the brain. And I now know that that is not true. The brain is a reducing valve or filter that allows in primordial consciousness. But I didn't realize all that before. That's been a huge part of the shift of my understanding since my NDE. And it turns out this parallels a shift in the modern scientific community where it's going in understanding the brain-mind connection and the nature of spiritual phenomena. With that kind of preamble, I'll take you back to November 10th of 2008. I woke up with severe back pain, soon realized I had a horrific headache, and within 2.5 hours was lapsing deep into coma. My family let me rest. When they checked on me again, I was having grand mal epileptic seizures on the bed at home. I was deep in coma and would stay in coma for the next 7 days. There's a myth out there perpetrated by an irresponsible writer who tried to claim that I had a medication-induced coma, whereas the scientific community will be first to tell you the important aspects of my journey are that it was a meningitis-induced coma. And that's important because the meningitis drives you into coma by destroying the neocortex, the outer surface of the brain, the part that makes us human. And in fact, there's a medical case report on my medical records that goes well beyond the book Proof of Heaven in terms of making the case that this could not have been a dream or hallucination, but had to be an actual spiritual experience. And that case report came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September 2018 by Dr. Surabhi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson. And in fact, when they were challenged by the peer review editors, how do you explain his unprecedented recovery? They said it's because he had a near-death experience. That explains his extraordinary level of recovery. They knew of similar cases. So anyway, without further ado, let me take you into what that experience was like. Important to point out that one of the atypical features of my near-death experience is that I was amnesic. And of course, I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, no knowledge of our language, of Earth, humanity. It was a truly empty slate. And what you'll find is NDEs are always tailored for the individual who has them. That's the only intended recipient. That's where their true value lies. Now, we can assess hundreds and thousands of NDEs and learn a tremendous amount about the nature of reality. But each NDE is really there for the individual. And for a neurosurgeon fascinated by consciousness, to get these really deep lessons, I had to go especially deep. And that demanded a very severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis. And that was really the gift to the scientific world. So in this very amnesic setting, with no memories of my lifetime, it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm, like being in dirty jello. And if I had just gone there, the earthworm's eye view, and then come back to this world, I would have had a negative NDE. They make up about 3 to 5% of all NDEs reported. And I think that they're generally just incomplete, like mine was incomplete in other ways. Well, it started in the earthworm eye view, which is kind of a primitive, coarse, unresponsive place. Lots of like being in dirty jello. I remember like roots or blood vessels around me. I had no body awareness during any part of that, but was just observing a speck of awareness. And what then happened was there came a slowly spinning white light that came out of the distance came associated with a perfect musical melody. And as that white light came towards me, slowly spinning, it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view realm and led me up into this brilliant ultra real gateway valley. Now, that would be where we reunite with higher souls, where we go through life reviews. It's an extraordinary realm because that is a realm where not only are you remembering events of a lifetime, but you have access to all the events of multiple lifetimes. And this can even include access to shaping up future lifetimes. It's a very kind of complex arrangement of higher temporal accessibility to many of the aspects of our lives. And it's not just a vague remembering. When you can see birth, death, everything in between, reliving all of that, it's far more real than this world. That's very important. That's what so many near-death experiencers talk about. And yet the general public has not yet fully accepted that extraordinary kind of view of NDEs as being kind of a higher state of consciousness that allows much more facile access to the many events of our existence than we generally are limited to. So that's what I was witnessing as I emerged up into this Gateway Valley from the very limited earthworm eye view. And in the Gateway Valley, there were many Earth-like features, all tremendous beauty. It's kind of like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. There was no sign of any death or decay. And I remember this lush meadow down below, surrounded by forests. There were sparkling waterfalls into crystal blue pools, and thousands of beings dancing in this meadow down below. And in my writings, weeks later, I said there were souls between lives. That seemed to me the most obvious kind of occupation of this realm of activity. I was witnessing all this because I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. Millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations. And I remember just being completely gobsmacked by the beauty and the tranquility and the peace and the harmony and the seeming fullness of this. It seemed like a spiritual home. I mean, I use all these words that may sound foreign to people, and yet there were thousands of people who contacted me after Proof of Heaven came out, or who had heard my early talks for the 2 years before the book came out on this very topic, who contacted me because they said it reminded them of some deep memory in their soul of something they had been through. And so I think it's the commonality of kind of language and experience, and that resonated with a huge portion of the population. Was on the New York Times bestseller list in the #1 position 42 weeks, and it was the #2 book of the year 2013 for nonfiction bestsellers in the New York Times list. It's published in more than 40 languages around the world. This resonated with a lot of people, and that's because of the nature of the story and how they could identify with many of the elements that I was describing. Now, in this Gateway Valley, as I said, it was a world of ideals. There was a lot of plant life, blossoms, buds on trees, flowers, blossoming, blooming, incredible festivities below. It was all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs, angelic choirs that would emanate chants, anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. This incredibly robust affirmation of that divine love of the God force at the core of all of this. I remember early in the experience in the Gateway Valley, a soft summer breeze that blew through and changed everything. That soft summer breeze, I called it in my writings the breath of God or the divine wind. And that was my first awareness in this amnesic setting, that God force of pure love was right there at the core of my conscious awareness. There was nothing separate about it at all. And in that very same kind of amazing world of ultra reality, I recognized I wasn't alone on the butterfly wing. There was a beautiful young woman, sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, high forehead, broad smile. She never said a word. She never had to. She was dressed in the same kind of colorful garb of all the beings dancing down below in the meadow. Very colorful and yet simple. And with that look of pure love as she gazed at me, the message telepathically delivered was rich, pure, real, authentic, and heartfelt. That message, I think, was the main message I was to bring back to this world. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And I cannot tell you what a beautiful gift that message was. And her very presence in the journey multiple times, every time I passed through that level, was a tremendous gift to me. She ended up being the messenger that proved to me the reality of the journey. With this beautiful young woman giving that assuring message of belonging, of being loved and cared for by the universe, finally, some of my deepest questions were being answered. And when I say that, I refer to the fact that I was adopted. My birth mother was 16 years old and unwed back in 1953. Social services took me from her at age 11 days for failure to thrive. I was hospitalized, but she was unwilling to sign the papers to let me go. So I was put in a baby dorm for 4 months. That is not the way a baby is meant to start this lifetime. And although my adoptive father, the neurosurgeon, who should know a lot about memory, would assure me that I couldn't possibly know about events that happened to me in the first weeks and months of my life, I came to recognize, especially after my NDE, that yes, I did have memories of that abandonment wound and that had flavored much of my life. And in fact, put up the challenge for this NDE journey of whether or not I was worthy of the love of the universe. And that, in fact, was answered very much in the affirmative through the journey. But for me personally, as an adoptee, that was a gigantic part of the benefit of my near-death experience. And yet I would say that all of us in many ways suffer from this kind of abandonment wound from the spiritual realm because all of us have been here before. And we've had prior lifetimes. We come back into these lives. That's true for most of us. I can't claim it for everyone. And we don't necessarily remember them because of programmed forgetting. Because at this stage in human development, there must be some value at giving us skin in the game by not having memories of past lives and between lives as we live these lives. And I think that's why that program forgetting happens. But the reality is you can find many cases past life memories in children that have support. For example, at the University of Virginia, they've studied 2,500 cases in the last 6 decades, and they found 1,700 cases of past life memories in children where they actually found the person who lived before. They solved the case. And so the evidence for reincarnation is overwhelming. Now, you might be unaware of it. You might say, well, I don't remember it, so it can't be true. But like I said, program forgetting affects most of us by our early, by age 6 or 7. So those memories are made to disappear. So we have that buy-in to this lifetime. Now, it turns out getting back to my near-death experience, what happened next was as all those worlds collapsed and I was out into that, the Gateway Valley for a starting point, but then all of that collapsed. And that includes that spiritual realm that has deep time or meta time that's not at all slave to the flow of earth time that we normally are here in these bodies, but is much more free form accessible to all the events of our lives. That's why the life review, your life flashing before your eyes in that realm is so important. It's a realm where you relive those events and they're relived from the perspective of everyone involved, not just your own perspective. So it shows us how that false sense of separation inherent in materialist science is so dangerous and misleading because we're truly all in this together, sharing that one consciousness bound together through forces of love. This is the gift to so many near-death experiencers as they go to those realms, bathe in that ocean of love, of that God force, and then come back to this world, realize we live in a far grander realm. Now, for me, the real gift is I ascended up, all of that world collapsed down until I was in the core. The core is an inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with that divine love of the God force. And I will point out that 90% plus of people who've had near-death experiences, no matter what their prior belief system, many of them previously atheists or materialists, but after the NDE, 90% of them come back knowing the reality of a loving personal force at the core of the universe. Now, it doesn't matter if you want to try and label that force as God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit. There are many names humans have applied to that infinitely loving, compassionate, and merciful force. The reality is NDEers will tell you it's real. And that's why they come back to this world, not fearing death of the physical body, because they realize that consciousness does not die with the death of the physical body, that our connections with loved ones go on. And that's where this scientific study of near-death experiences, of shared death experiences, which are just like near-death, they have a lot of the same ingredients, and yet they happen in people who are perfectly healthy, usually a loved one who could be 1,000 miles away from the person who's dying. It doesn't matter. Space is not an impediment in the spiritual realm. And so you can have very profound connections with a loved one dying thousands of miles away as their soul whisks you along on the journey. And this is what I was just beginning to witness in all of this, because in that core realm, I was given many lessons that included the depths of the reality of the life review, of life flashing before your eyes, of reincarnation. Every bit of that was writ large in this incredible journey. The kind of visions I had in that core realm that supported this bigger spiritual reality. One was I call the flying fish version. It's kind of as it sounds, fish down in the water like us in these material bodies, temporarily dumbed down to the knowledge of the higher soul, and just living these lives, learning these lessons, growing and teaching. But then we come to the end of that physical body and we pop back out into the air as these flying fish. And that's where we reunite with souls of departed loved ones, go through life reviews, see what lessons we need to learn and teach in the next incarnation, plan the specific hardships that will offer up those lessons, and then we dive back in. And then a later passage through the core, an even richer, more profound vision of life reviews and of reincarnation in the form of what I call the Indra's net vision. And this was a far more elaborate vision of a tapestry throughout higher dimensional space-time. And this tapestry involved these interwoven threads that were basically like the weave of our very lives as souls. So that incarnation is part of the weave, and then between lives, life review, reuniting with souls of departed loved ones, then rebirth into a new body to learn new lessons and teach new lessons, souls taking different roles in the next incarnation, then diving back in. So this weave and flow of the web of growth, of transformation, of evolution of consciousness itself was very apparent to me in this Indra's net version, with this incredible glowing center of pure divine consciousness at the core of it all. So this is where we're all headed, is this incredible vision of togetherness, of kind of understanding our connection through love, how we're here to help each other. And it turns out I would just tumble back down spontaneously from that sanctum sanctorum of the divine in the core realm back to the earthworm's eye view. And it was by remembering the musical notes of the melody. That's what allowed me to conjure up that light portal so that I could re-enter the spiritual realm. And then by witnessing those beautiful angelic choirs above, reassured again by that guardian angel on the butterfly wing, the angels above provided yet another musical portal to higher and higher levels as I saw all of that earth, the Gateway Valley, collapsing yet again for more lessons in the core realm. Multiple passages. The deepest lessons have to do with love and oneness and connection. And I went through that multiple times. Again, this amnesia was very prominent throughout. If I had scripted it, my adoptive father would have been there front and center. He had passed over 4 years before my coma. And yet in this dramatic 2008 near-death experience, he was nowhere to be found. And a huge part of that was that amnesia was still challenging me and kind of forcing me to go deep to come into these lessons. Back in that week of November 10th to 16th of 2008, that's where I went through this incredible journey. And I cycled through multiple times. And just as I had been told, every time I entered the core, we'll teach you many things, but you're not here to stay. There came a point where, remembering the musical notes of the melody, I could conjure up the light portals, and then the angelic choirs and the Gateway Valley providing yet another portal up there. And yet there came a time when I could no longer use those musical notes to conjure up the light portal. And I was stuck down at that earthworm eye view. To say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but I knew I could trust I would be taken care of. I'd been promised that multiple times in these passages through the Gateway Valley and the core, by that beautiful guardian angel, and by that infinitely loving God force at the core of everything that I witnessed in the core realm. And very important to point out, the other reality I saw in that core realm is the very source of conscious awareness is that God force. So none of us are ever separate from it in any way. But we can fool ourselves in our culture, in our ego minds, etc., that we're not worthy of that we're separate from that, we're distant from that. And yet the deep truth of prayer, of centering prayer and meditation, can show us that we always have access to that infinitely loving God force at the core of the universe. And this is why I'm such a fan of Sacred Acoustics. Full disclosure here, sacredacoustics.com was co-founded by my co-partner, Karen Newell, who is also my wife, and she's also the co-author of the book, Living in a Mindful Universe. She's been a tremendous spiritual mentor to me for the last 12 years, plus a very important part of my understanding of all of this. And thanks to Karen that book, I think, has so much power to it. It's of uniting science and spirituality. and she kept it very readable. But it turns out that that was just trying to get the word out about my experience, to share this with many other people. I know I've heard from a tremendous number of scientists, engineers, doctors, nurses, others with a scientific background, with tremendous gratitude for telling the story, so that people realize materialism is not the answer. It's not what science would even defend to this day. Materialism has been disproven over the last century as an inadequate and inept model of reality. And materialism says brain creates consciousness. Well, that is just not so. And we need a much bigger model of consciousness with the brain as a filter. And that's what I have spent the last 15 years of my life since his coma working on. But you'll realize this is not just Eben Alexander talking about, his own musings about science, but something that's very much supported by many scientists around the world. And in fact, many of those thought leaders in consciousness studies have endorsed our books to point out that this is a valid pathway forward to coming to a deeper understanding. And for me, I love that I participated in many of these scientific efforts. For those of you who are not yet aware, go to bigelowinstitute.org. You will find 29 essays from reputable scientists, all of whom have professed at least a 5-year history in studying the afterlife question. And in those 29 essays, you'll find a tremendous amount of scientific evidence that fully supports the reality not only of the afterlife, but of reincarnation. So we really need to open our minds to this. I am so grateful that I've had this extraordinary experience. Once I realized what had happened, and I recognized that 4 months post-coma when I received that picture in the mail of my birth sister, that all of a sudden I knew the origin of that beautiful guardian angel on the butterfly wing in my NDE. What a shocking, absolutely amazing gift from the universe to come to this understanding and have that given to me. And that's why I've spent the last 15 years sharing this story as broadly and widely as I can. So anyone who wants to learn more about my experience, you can go to Eben, E-B-E-N, Alexander.com. I especially recommend there the recommended reading list, also a way to reach out to me to ask questions. If you're a fellow NDEer, I love hearing from you. It's a tremendous benefit to my journey and highly recommended to help each and every one of you. Ultimately, this is about an awakening of the scientific community and the world at large. And religions have had more than 5,000 years to teach us the golden rule, to treat others with love and kindness and compassion and mercy. And it just so happens that the science of consciousness, deeply diving into these kind of stories like near-death experiences, shared death experiences, after-death communications, and finding a tremendous amount of reality in these investigations that show it's not just wishful thinking, but that we're getting real evidence of ongoing existence that's helpful in the here and now to improve our lives, not just, vague wishful remembering of past events with our loved ones, but they can come through and help us in living our lives here and now and being more healthy and wholesome in the process. And that's where meditation and centering prayer can be such a gift. I think probably the final thing I should point out, because it's a question that often comes up, and that is, why did I come back? In the setting of amnesia, for most of the journey, I thought this can continue, it can cease, doesn't matter. The amnesia was very valuable in many ways, but it was kind of interfering with my kind of knowing my connection and making a connection to come back to this world. And that's why at the very end of my journey, I had 2 major experiences. One was seeing thousands of beings going off around me into the distance, many with heads down, this murmuring energy coming from them. And when I wrote it all up weeks later, I said that was the power of prayer bringing me back to this world. Well, it turns out that the last thing I saw in my 7-day coma were 6 faces that would bubble up out of the muck, say a few words, and disappear. Because of my amnesia, I still didn't understand the words, but it was really the 6 of those faces that got my attention. All of them were important because they proved to me that the vast majority of the spiritual journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of the 7-day coma. And the details of all that time are explained in the book Proof of Heaven and in Living in a Mindful Universe. But it turns out it's the last face that really got my attention. That's the reason I came back to this world. In spite of thinking this can all continue or not, doesn't matter, the last face was of a 10-year-old boy. It was my son, Bond. I didn't recognize him at the time, didn't know who he was, but it turns out they had protected Bond from the worst news during this week in my coma. But that day 7 of coma, where the doctors held a conference and they said I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival down to 2%, with no chance of recovery. And that's why they recommended stopping the antibiotics and just letting me go. Bond overheard all that. He'd been protected from that kind of bad news during the week, but now all of a sudden it was very frightening. Came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids, one eye over there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible picture. And I promise you, I didn't see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears, so I was far too gone from this body in the dying process. But somehow his message got through. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay, as if somehow his pleading would make it so. And it did get through. And I knew now a sense of kind of terror because I had to be there for him. And I didn't know what that involved. And so far, I'd learned precious little about how I could influence the workings of that world. But it turns out that that was enough. That message of love and connection, my sense of responsibility to another soul was enough so that through my higher soul, I was able to manifest and come back to this world. So that a short time later, I was waking up, fighting the ventilator. As I did that, they pulled out the breathing tube. I said, thank you. And I remember my sister Phyllis telling me later, it was like I was a little Buddha sitting there on the bed. And they'd been so worried about me all week, hearing how I was going to die or recover, but have no recovery, live through it. And here I was seemingly about to wake up. And she said, I was looking at everyone at the bedside there, doctors, nurses, family, friends. I'd look at them in the eyes and I'd say, don't worry, all is well. And then I moved to the next one. Don't worry, all is well. That was my reassurance. And she said it was so bizarre coming from someone they'd been so worried about. And here I was reassuring them. But that's because I was only just beginning to share that story. And as all my amnesic memories came back to me over the next 2 months, that's when I became fully capable of really recognizing what had happened, what a miracle it was, and how important it was for me to share that story with my fellow human beings. So thank you for your attention and blessings to you all.
Thanks for watching today's video. If you want to learn how to create a profitable YouTube channel like this one, click the link in the description and let us show you how. See you on the next one.